related to the topic of 3 hours off. Does it apply to full-time and part-time employees?
You're going to have to bring every employee to cover the person.
The law does not distinguish. I should just add, because I don't think it's come up in the prior conversations about this section, that there is a requirement of providing 2 days' notice to your employer.
But do you think it will potentially apply to part-time employees? Somebody who works 4 hours a day, they're going to get 3 hours off to vote and 1 hour to work?
Then you're going to have to bring in people to cover them while they go vote.
You know, the right to vote, obviously, is a constitutional right. Just because someone is working part-time at one location doesn't mean they're not working part-time at a second job at another location. So
You bring up a great point. What if I have 2 jobs? Does each employer have to give me 3 hours off?
Well, we encourage people to vote just once, even though sometimes we will kid around and tell them to vote twice. So you're only supposed to vote once, so you should only be entitled to have the 3 hours off to vote once.
Is there a mechanism in place that would verify that someone isn't using 2 employers and getting 3 hours of time?
No, in the same way there's not some procedure in place to make sure somebody isn't signing up for a colonoscopy every other week.
Interesting analogy. But that leads me to a question. If an employee says 2 days notice, hey, I need some time to go vote, and they leave for 3 hours, and they don't vote, and they're paid those 3 hours, how is that different than punching in for 3 hours when you're not working? And should it be prosecutable, or would it be prosecutable?
I don't believe it's a crime to intend to vote and then decide not to vote. You know, if an employer were to determine that someone on election day took off 3 hours and then they determined they didn't vote, they certainly could, I would think they could dock them that pay, but this is, there is no one is going around and checking to see if they actually went to the polling site and voted.
3 hours.
Right, but if I have 100 employees and they all get $15 an hour, which is the minimum wage in some places, that's $45 times 100 employees. That's big money. Is it on me, the employer, to police whether the people are actually voting?
Well, right now it is, as I said, all we are doing is we're basically adding the hours, so from 2 hours to 3 hours. We don't set up a mechanism to follow people to the polls to make sure they're voting.
Could I close my hypothetical restaurant on election day to avoid this? Any prohibition on that?
If you decide if someone decides they don't want their business open on election day, that's their clearly.
Well, here's why it's a logical question. If I have to allow some employees to leave for 3 hours, now I have to bring in other employees to fill in for them, and they have to get 3 hours. It seems like a never-ending cycle. I might just say, you know what, I'm going to close. I want to make sure there's no prohibition on employers closing on election day.
You know, so the current law, and then we're adding the extra hour, has to do with someone coming in at the beginning of the day,
Sure.
later, or leaving early.
Yes.
You know, again, if someone wants to close their business, that's their option. We're trying to allow people to have the opportunity to exercise their constitutional right to vote. Polling sites are not on every corner, and often there can be long lines and waits at a polling site, and many people have family obligations, other second jobs, as I mentioned, obligations that prevent them from being able to spend the time they're not working, waiting at a polling site to vote.
Great, fair enough. And only someone who's a citizen and a registered voter would be eligible for this, what amounts to a benefit. Will the state hold harmless the employer when the non-citizen or non-registered voter sues the employer for unequal treatment? In other words, some employees are going to have a 3-hour paid break. Other employees, because they're not a citizen or because they're not registered to vote, are not. That opens Pandora's box of litigation. Will the state hold harmless the employer when that happens, which in this litigious state it inevitably will?
Well, I don't think there's an equal protection claim for someone not getting time off because they're not allowed to vote.
Really, if you got 3 hours off, but the guy working next to you didn't get the 3 hours off, you might be upset because of his citizenship status.
Yes. Yes, I mean, you know, there's lots of things in the law we have time offer that other people don't have advantage. We have family leave. That doesn't mean that someone who doesn't have a child can say, I didn't get my family leave because I didn't have a child.
Actually, we just did that. We expanded family leave to cover people who don't have children, but so that kind of does show where we're going with this legislation.
Okay.
Let me move on to my next question. Sure. This is going to be expensive. Do we know how much it will cost the employers of New York State?
No.
Hundreds of thousands, millions.
On the bill, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, a half dozen of my colleagues, maybe more, have punched so many holes in this piece of legislation. I don't know what's left of it. It doesn't belong in a budget. It clearly hasn't been thought through. Basic questions of who it applies to and who it doesn't apply to have not been addressed, cannot be addressed. We should pull this out of the budget and maybe debate as a standalone bill, but we're talking about a $175 billion budget here, and huge portions of it, including this, have not been thought through. So I'll be voting in the negative. Thank you.